I didn't plan on making a big deal out of my 48th work anniversary. If anything, I wanted the opposite. Quiet lunch, a handshake, maybe a cheap plaque, then back to work. I've never been the guy who needs applause to feel valuable. I've always believed the work speaks for itself. But that morning, when I walked into the office, the lobby screen had my name on it in bold letters. Congratulations, Ethan Cole. 48 years. Seeing it like that hit me in a place I didn't expect, not pride exactly. More like a strange disbelief that my life had been measured in badge swipes and quarterly deadlines, and that I'd somehow lasted long enough to become a number on a screen. People I barely spoke to stopped me in the hall. 48 years? That's insane. You started here before I was born. Legend. They said it like it was flattering. I smiled, nodded, did the small talk, but inside I felt exposed, like they'd pinned a label on my back that read, old, and everyone was pretending it was a compliment. The celebration was scheduled for 12:30 in the large conference space next to the executive wing. That alone made it feel different. We didn't use that room unless someone important was visiting, or someone else was being recognized for something that looked good in a newsletter. When I walked in, there were balloons, corporate-approved colors, nothing too bright, a banner that looked like it came out of an HR template, a catering table with sandwiches and salads arranged like they'd been measured, and a small podium up front with a microphone. I froze for half a second because my first thought was stupid. Why is there a microphone? I found my team clustered near the back, the way people do when they don't want to be seen trying too hard. A few of them patted my shoulder, told me I deserved it. Someone handed me a paper plate and tried to joke about how I should have retired 10 years ago. I laughed. The laugh came out a little thin. Then I noticed the executives. Not all of them. Not the full slate you'd see at a real company event, but enough to send a message. Director level, a couple VPs, HR leadership, and, standing near the front like he owned the floor, our new VP of Operations. His name was Grant Holloway. Grant had joined the company 6 months earlier after a strategic restructuring that somehow always meant layoffs for people who did actual work and promotions for people who wore their confidence like a tailored jacket. Grant was polished in a way that never looked accidental. Crisp suit, perfect hair, the kind of smile that didn't move his eyes, the kind of man who could talk for 10 minutes and say nothing you could quote him on. I'd met him twice. Both times he'd called me a cornerstone, like he'd read it off a flashcard. Both times he'd asked what I did exactly, even though my name was on every system approval chain that kept our operations from collapsing. I kept my distance. That's how you survive in an office when you're old enough to be considered legacy. You do your job, you stay useful, you don't give anyone a reason to label you a problem. At 12:35, HR clinked a spoon against a cup and asked everyone to gather around. A few people took out their phones. I felt my neck get warm. A woman from HR gave a speech about commitment, loyalty, the kind of safe language that sounds nice but doesn't cost the company anything. Then my director said a few words, mostly about institutional knowledge, which is a phrase people use when they need you but don't want to pay you like they need you. I stood there with my hands loosely folded, smiling when it was appropriate, waiting for it to be over. Then Grant stepped up. He didn't check notes. He didn't clear his throat. He just took the microphone like it belonged to him. I've been in a lot of organizations, he said, voice smooth, steady, trained. And it's rare to meet someone like Ethan. 48 years is not just time, it's influence. It's building something that lasts longer than any one person. A small wave of applause went through the room. Grant nodded like he'd expected it. Then he looked directly at me, and the smile on his face widened a fraction. And I know, he continued, that when you've been somewhere this long, you've seen trends come and go, leaders come and go, priorities shift, but you've stayed. He paused, letting the silence stretch. That kind of consistency, he said softly, deserves a proper toast. He stepped away from the podium and walked to the catering table where someone had set up a line of plastic champagne flutes and a couple bottles of sparkling wine. I didn't love the idea of drinking in the office, but it wasn't unheard of. Milestone events sometimes had a toast. Usually it was symbolic. One sip, a few photos. Then everyone went back to pretending they weren't jealous or bored. Grant picked up a bottle and held it up. "Let's do this right," he said, grinning at the crowd. People laughed. The mood lifted. Phones came up again. Grant popped the cork. It wasn't dramatic, no spray, no mess, just a clean, practiced motion. He poured into a few cups, handing them out to executives first, then HR, then whoever was closest. Then he poured one more cup. And instead of letting someone bring it to me, he walked it over himself. He held it with both hands, like it was something fragile. The gesture was intimate, not personal. Grant didn't do personal, but performative intimacy, like a public handshake that says, "Look how generous I'm being. Look how decent I am." He stopped in front of me and lifted the cup. "To Ethan," he said, voice a little louder now. 48 years of loyalty, 48 years of showing up, 48 years of doing what most people can't. The room clapped, loud enough to fill the space. Grant leaned closer, just enough that only I could hear the last part. "Let's make this a clean ending," he murmured, still smiling. My smile didn't move, because that phrase, clean ending, didn't belong at an anniversary. It belonged at a termination. I stared at the cup in his hands. Clear plastic, pale bubbles. Nothing visibly wrong, no smell, nothing sharp. Just sparkling wine. Just a toast. And yet I felt a hard, cold certainty settle in my chest. I'd been in offices long enough to know the difference between kindness and choreography. Grant's eyes held mine, calm and steady. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't improvising. He was waiting for a beat in a script he'd already rehearsed. I took the cup. The plastic was cool against my fingers. The bubbles rose and popped against the inside like it wanted me to hurry. "Thank you," I said. Because that's what you say when you're trying not to show your instincts. Grant lifted his own cup. "Cheers," he said. Everyone lifted theirs. The room leaned into the moment. And right then, right before the cups touched, my eyes caught something that made my stomach tighten. Not the drink itself. Grant's other hand, his thumb pressed against his phone screen inside his jacket pocket, like he'd been recording or triggering something or timing it. A tiny motion, a tiny detail. But I've built my whole career on noticing tiny details before they become disasters. So I raised the cup. I smiled. I brought it close enough that everyone could see the gesture. And I didn't drink. I let my lips touch the rim just barely, like a kiss for the cameras, then lowered it again. No one gasped. No one stopped clapping. In a room full of people, most didn't notice. But Grant noticed. His smile held for half a second longer, then tightened at the corners, like he'd just watched a door fail to lock. He leaned in again, still smiling like a man in control. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm great," I said, and I meant it in a way he didn't understand yet. Because whatever he thought that toast was going to do, whatever story he planned to tell after, I just refused to play my assigned role. Grant lifted his cup and drank his own, slow and confident, eyes never leaving mine. Then he clapped me on the shoulder, firm enough to feel like a claim. The crowd began to break apart. Plates moved, conversations resumed. The event started dissolving into a normal workday, but my body didn't relax. It stayed alert, like it knew something was coming. And as I walked back to my desk, cup still in my hand, my phone buzzed once. A calendar invite. No subject line I recognized. Just a meeting request for 4 p.m. with HR, legal, and Grant Holloway. And beneath it, a single sentence in the description, attendance required. The meeting sat on my calendar like a bruise you keep pressing just to make sure it's real. 4 p.m. HR, legal, Grant, no agenda, no dial-in notes, no courtesy explanation. In this company, meetings without context were never neutral. They were containers. Whatever they planned to put inside, you hadn't been told yet. I went back to my desk and did what I've always done when something feels off. I worked, not as a distraction, as reconnaissance. I pulled up the system logs I was responsible for maintaining. Quietly, casually, the same dashboards I'd checked for years. Access patterns, approval trails, nothing sensitive, nothing that would raise a flag. Just confirming what I already suspected. Everything I touched still worked. Everything I approved still showed my name. I hadn't been locked out, not yet. Around me, the office buzzed with post-event chatter. A few people stopped by. "Nice speech," someone said. "Didn't think they'd make such a big deal," another joked. A junior analyst asked if I'd kept the plaque. I smiled, answered politely. Stored faces, stored tones. Because something else had changed. People were watching me more closely than they had that morning. Not openly, not with concern. With calibration. Like they were trying to see which version of me would show up next. At 2:11 p.m., my director sent me a Slack message. "You good?" Big day. I stared at it longer than necessary before replying. "All good? Just another Tuesday?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No follow-up. That told me enough. At 3:20, HR emailed asking me to bring my badge and laptop to the meeting for administrative review. The language was soft, but the intent wasn't. That's when irritation crept in. Not panic, not fear. Irritation. Because this wasn't subtle anymore. This was a pattern I'd seen before, just never aimed at me. I packed my laptop slowly. Not because I needed time, but because rushing gives people the wrong impression. Rushing looks guilty. Calm looks inconvenient. On my way to the conference room, I passed the kitchenette. The catering hadn't been fully cleared yet. Empty bottles, used cups, half-eaten trays. One of the servers was stacking plastic flutes into a crate. I paused, nodded at her. "Long day," I said. She smiled, polite, but tired. "Always is after these things." I gestured lightly toward the crate. "Didn't expect champagne at noon." She hesitated, just a fraction. "Wasn't on the original order," she said. Added last minute. "By who?" She shrugged. "Executive assistant. Tall guy. Sharp suit." Grant. I thanked her and kept walking. That wasn't proof of anything, but it was confirmation of intent. The conference room door was already closed when I arrived. Inside, HR sat together on one side of the table, legal on the other, Grant at the head, hands folded, expression neutral enough to pass for concern. No one stood when I entered. I placed my laptop on the table, set my badge beside it. HR smiled first, the kind of smile you practice in a mirror. "Ethan, thank you for coming," she said. "Please have a seat." I sat. Grant leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "We just want to have a conversation," he said. "Clear the air?" I nodded. "Happy to." Legal didn't speak yet. That mattered. HR continued. "There were some observations made today, at the event." "Observations," I repeated. Grant tilted his head. "You seemed unsettled." I waited. "You declined the toast," HR added gently, "in front of your peers." "I held the cup," I said. I smiled. I thanked everyone. "But you didn't drink." "No," I agreed. Grant sighed softly, as if disappointed. "After everything we did to celebrate you." That was the hook, the emotional framing. I met his eyes. "I don't drink at work events." "That's not accurate," he said smoothly. "I have photos from last year's Q4 mixer." Of course he did. "Last year," I said, "I'd already cleared it with my director. 1 sip. Different circumstances." Grant smiled thinly. "So today felt different." "Yes," I said. HR leaned forward. "Can you explain why?" This was the moment they expected something messy. A personal reason, a story. An excuse they could write down and reinterpret later. I didn't give them one. "I wasn't feeling well," I said. "That's all." Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Legal finally spoke. "Did you consume any alcohol at the event?" "No." Did you feel pressured to? I paused, just long enough. I was handed a drink during a public toast, I said carefully. I made my own decision. Silence followed. Grant cleared his throat. Ethan, no one is accusing you of anything, but perception matters, especially at your level. My level? I said. Which is what, exactly? HR exchanged a glance with legal. Grant answered, Senior legacy staff, high visibility, close to transitions. There it was. I nodded slowly. So this meeting is about perception. Grant smiled again. Relief flickered across his face. He thought I'd stepped into the box willingly. In part, he said, we also need to discuss your role going forward. I waited. HR slid a folder across the table, but didn't open it. We're considering some realignment, she said. Reducing dependencies, streamlining oversight. Legal watch me now. Grant added, nothing decided yet. But days like today remind us how important adaptability is. I leaned back in my chair. The irritation faded. What replaced it was clarity. Because now I understood why the toast mattered. It wasn't about embarrassing me. It was about testing me. They needed to see if I would comply instinctively or hesitate in public. They needed a first data point. Hey, I looked at Grant and smiled. I'm adaptable, I said. That's why I've lasted 48 years. Grant nodded. Good. HR reached for the folder. We'll need to hold on to your badge and laptop for the rest of the day, just as a formality. I slid both forward without resistance. No argument, no surprise. As I stood to leave, Grant said casually, Go home early. Big day. I paused at the door. I will, I said. But before I do, can you clarify something for me? Grant raised an eyebrow. Sure. Who requested this meeting? A beat. Then he smiled. I did. I nodded once and left. In the hallway, my phone buzzed again. An internal alert. Access change scheduled. Effective tomorrow, 9 a.m. They thought the story was moving forward. They didn't realize I'd already started reading the ending. I didn't go home early. I went back to my floor, sat at my desk, and waited until the office thinned out the way it always does after something uncomfortable. People leave faster when they've witnessed a scene they don't want to process. By 6:12 p.m., the lights above the far cubicles had gone dark. By 6:30, only a handful of us were left, the kind of employees who either care too much or have nowhere else to be. That's when I opened my notebook, not a digital one. A paper notebook I'd kept for years in my bottom drawer. It wasn't sentimental, it was practical. Digital logs can be altered. Paper can't be silently edited. I wrote down everything. Times, words, who spoke first, who avoided eye contact. Then I turned to something more important. Patterns. Grant's behavior didn't match a spontaneous HR concern. It matched a staged escalation. The toast, the meeting, the access change, all preloaded, all dependent on me reacting the right way at the celebration, which meant the drink hadn't been the objective. My reaction had been. At 6:41, my phone rang. Unknown internal extension. I let it ring twice before answering. Ethan, Grant said. His voice was warmer now, friendlier. Just checking in. About? I asked. I know today was a lot. Change always feels heavier when it's tied to recognition. Recognition. Another word used to soften removal. I'm fine, I said. Good, he replied, because I'd hate for misunderstandings to cloud what's coming next. I waited. We're doing a leadership sync tomorrow morning, he continued. I mentioned you? That so? Yes. I framed you as steady, someone who knows how to exit with dignity when the moment's right. There it was. I didn't respond. Grant filled the silence. You've earned respect, Ethan. We want to protect your legacy. Protect. Exit. Legacy. Words you don't use when someone's future is intact. I appreciate the call, I said evenly. We'll talk more tomorrow, Grant replied. Get some rest. The line went dead. I sat there for a full minute after, phone still in my hand. Then I opened my email. There were already changes in motion. A systems architect I'd mentored for 8 years had been added to approvals I normally handled alone. A compliance thread I was looped into had quietly removed my name. Nothing dramatic, just enough to start rewriting the narrative of who mattered. They weren't firing me yet. They were replacing the story before replacing the person. At 7:10, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the event photos, not the glossy ones HR would share, the raw uploads from employees, unfiltered angles, half-framed moments. I scanned faces. That's when I saw it. In 3 different photos, taken minutes apart, Grant's eyes weren't on the crowd. They were on me, not smiling, not celebratory, evaluating, and in one photo, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, his thumb was pressing against his phone inside his jacket pocket. Same motion, same pressure, a habit. I zoomed in. There was no visible app, no flash, no confirmation. But I didn't need proof of recording. I needed proof of intent. At 7:42, the cleaning crew arrived. The day was officially over. I shut down my monitor, locked my drawer, and walked to the elevators. On the ride down, my reflection in the mirrored wall looked older than it had that morning, but also sharper, like something had clicked into place. That night at home, I didn't pour a drink, I didn't vent, I didn't pace. I sat at the kitchen table and mapped my career like a timeline. Every system I'd approved, every exception I'd signed, every emergency call that had gone through me instead of illegal. Not because I wanted leverage, because I needed to understand exposure, and that's when I saw it. A gap. 2 years ago, Grant's predecessor had pushed through a vendor consolidation during a rush quarter. The documentation had been rushed. I'd flagged it at the time, not formally, just enough to slow it down. Grant hadn't been there yet, but the contract still lived, and it lived under an operational exception, approved verbally, logged later, signed in good faith. By me. If something went wrong there, it wouldn't hit Grant first. It would hit the name on the approval chain. Mine. They weren't just moving me out. They were positioning me under something unstable. I slept poorly that night, not from fear, but from calculation. By morning, the plan wasn't emotional anymore. It was structural. At 8:17 a.m., before the scheduled access change took effect, I sent one email. Not an accusation, not a warning, a request. I asked compliance for a routine clarification on vendor exception handling, specifically asking how verbal approvals were documented under transitional leadership. I CC'd legal. And I set the subject line to something so boring it couldn't be ignored. Question RAI, approval attribution, ops legacy accounts. Then I shut my laptop. At 9:03 a.m., my access still worked. At 9:17, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Grant. It was legal. And the first thing they said told me everything had shifted. Ethan, the attorney said carefully, before we proceed with any role changes, we need to understand something. Why is your name appearing on approvals that predate Grant's tenure, but were revalidated under his authority? I leaned back in my chair. The room was quiet, and for the first time since the toast, I knew exactly where this was going. The tone of the calls changed immediately. Not louder, not angrier, careful. By 10:30 that morning, I had 3 calendar invites: compliance, legal, and a working session with operations leadership. Grant wasn't listed on any of them. That omission mattered. In this company, power didn't disappear. It relocated. The compliance call came first. 2 people I'd worked with for years. No pleasantries, no small talk. They asked me to walk them through the vendor exception process from 2 years earlier. I didn't editorialize. I didn't defend myself. I explained the workflow exactly as it existed then, what was written policy, what was customary practice, and where verbal approvals were historically used during leadership transitions. I used dates. I used names. I used their language. When they asked why I'd approved it, I answered plainly. Operations requested continuity. Legal hadn't flagged risk at that stage. I documented the exception per guidance. There was a pause. Then one of them asked the question Grant should have been afraid of. Who revalidated the contract after the transition? I didn't hesitate. Grant Holloway. Silence again. Longer this time. Legal asked me to stay on the line. Grant still hadn't called me. By noon, my badge still worked. My laptop still worked. But the office felt different. People weren't avoiding me anymore. They were avoiding him. Whispers move fast when they have paperwork to carry them. At 12:47, HR emailed. Please disregard prior access hold. We are pausing all role adjustments pending review. Pausing. That word doesn't exist unless someone above you says it. The operations working session started at 2 p.m. Grant joined late. When his camera came on, the smile was gone. He didn't look angry. He looked misaligned, like the room wasn't responding to the version of him he'd practiced. He opened with control. Let's keep this focused. Compliance took over immediately. They shared a screen, a timeline, approvals, revalidations, email chains, dates that didn't care about charisma. Grant tried to redirect. This feels like scope creep. Legal stopped him. It's scope definition. Then the question came, the one that collapses rooms. Grant, why were operational exceptions revalidated without updated risk review? Grant leaned back, folded his arms. The same posture he'd used with me. Legacy systems, he said. Inherited complexity. Compliance didn't blink. Then why was Ethan's access scheduled for removal the day after he declined a public toast? That was the first time my name came up like a shield instead of a liability. Grant laughed once, too quickly. Are we seriously connecting those things? Legal answered. We are when pattern and timing align. The meeting didn't explode. It compressed. Questions stacked. Explanations thinned. Grant's words started circling instead of landing. At 2:38 p.m., compliance asked about the drink. Not emotionally, procedurally. Why was alcohol added last minute to an internal event? Grant shrugged. Morale. Who approved it? Another shrug. I assumed. Legal cut in. Assumptions don't approve expenses. Grant's jaw tightened. Then HR asked something small. Were any recordings made during the event? Grant smiled reflexively. Of course not. Compliance leaned forward. Then why do 3 witnesses report seeing you operate your phone during the toast? The chaos didn't come from shouting. It came from overconfidence meeting documentation. At 3:12 p.m., Grant requested a break. At 3:14, compliance denied it. At 3:20, legal asked him to step off the call. Not suspended, not terminated, removed. The meeting continued without him. No one looked at me like I'd won. They looked at me like they'd misread the room for months. By end of day, the vendor contract was under formal review. Grant's approvals were frozen pending investigation. HR sent out a neutral email about temporary leadership coverage. Temporary. That night, I left the office at a normal hour. No victory lap, no announcement, just the quiet understanding that something heavy had shifted off my shoulders and onto someone else's. My phone buzzed once in the elevator, a message from Grant. We should talk. I didn't reply, because for the first time since the toast, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was waiting for the ending he'd written for himself. The investigation didn't end with a headline. It never does. There was no announcement, no company-wide email naming Grant or explaining what had happened. Just a slow, deliberate unwinding, the way organizations correct a mistake without admitting it made one. On Monday morning, Grant's name was gone from the org chart. Not replaced. Removed. An interim lead was listed instead. A quiet, competent woman from another division who didn't smile too much and didn't talk about culture. She called me before noon. I'm reviewing operations dependencies, she said. I'd like your help. Not need. Help? I agreed. By Wednesday, compliance finalized their report. They didn't send it to me, and they didn't have to. I saw the effects instead. The vendor contract was suspended. The revalidation approvals were reassigned. My name was restored to every system it had quietly disappeared from, then annotated clearly and permanently, with contemporaneous notes documenting who had assumed authority after the transition. Nothing flashy, just accuracy. HR called me in late that afternoon. No folder this time, no legal, just a conversation. They thanked me for my professionalism, for my patience, for raising concerns the right way. I let them talk. Then HR asked what I wanted. It wasn't a trap, not anymore. I told them the truth. I don't want revenge. I want closure and a clean record. They nodded. I got both. Grant didn't resign. He wasn't escorted out. He took a personal leave that quietly turned permanent. His LinkedIn updated a month later with vague language about seeking new challenges. No one asked me what really happened. They didn't need to. People in offices like this don't trade gossip. They trade signals. And the signal was clear. Pushing out the wrong person can cost you more than keeping them. 2 weeks later, I had my final meeting. Not a termination, a conversation about timing. I chose 6 months. Time to document properly. Time to hand things over the way they should be handed over, not erased, not rushed, not weaponized. On my last day, there was no microphone, no toast, just my team, a quiet handshake, and a card signed by people who'd actually worked with me. I packed my things slowly. When I reached the lobby, I passed the same screen that had announced my anniversary. It was blank now. As I walked out, I thought about the drink I hadn't taken, how close it came to becoming a story someone else would tell about me, and how easy it is to underestimate someone who doesn't raise their voice. I never confronted Grant. I never accused him. I just refused to play the part he wrote. Because real revenge doesn't look like anger. It looks like staying still long enough for the truth to catch up. And when it does, you don't need to say a word.